Could one decision in a war tell you more than 100 speeches ever could? Because while the world waited for Iran to shut the Strait of Hormuz, its new supreme leader chose a different target, and that choice may be the clearest message he has sent so far. And before we break that signal apart, do this with me. Tap like if you enjoy clear analysis, subscribe if you want the bigger picture, and share this video with the one person who always reads past the headline. For days, the expectation was simple. If the United States kept hitting Iranian targets, Iran would answer with the most dangerous move available. Close Hormuz, choke the energy artery of the world, shock oil markets, force every major power to react. That was the scenario people had repeated for years. Analysts talked about it, markets feared it, militaries planned around it. And then the pressure rose, the strikes came, the region held its breath, and Iran did not pull that trigger. Instead, tankers were hit near the strait. Not the whole passage, not every ship, not a total shutdown. Just enough violence to make the world flinch, but not enough to lock the whole system in place. That difference matters more than it looks. In fact, it may be the whole story, because when a new leader takes power during a crisis, every early move becomes a kind of introduction, not a polite one, a strategic one. He is telling enemies how far he may go. He is telling allies what kind of discipline he has. He is telling neutral countries whether he is reckless, emotional, patient, or cold. And sometimes, what he refuses to do says even more than what he actually does. That is why this moment deserves a closer look. Not because tankers getting hit is small. It is not small. It is serious. But the deeper point is that Iran had a bigger option, a louder option, a more dramatic option, and chose not to use it. So the real question is not, why did Iran strike? The real question is, why did it strike this way? To answer that, we have to step back from the noise and think like a strategist. What does closing Hormuz really mean? And why would a government under pressure avoid doing the one thing the world expected? The Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway on the map. It is one of the most sensitive choke points in global trade. A huge share of the world's oil and gas moves through that narrow passage. Countries across Asia depend on it. Energy markets watch it constantly. Insurance firms price risk around it. Navies patrol around it. So, when people say Hormuz matters, they are not exaggerating. They mean the strait is one of the places where local conflict can become global pain in a matter of hours. And Iran knows that better than anyone. For decades, the threat of disruption in Hormuz has been one of Tehran's strongest forms of leverage. It is the warning sitting quietly in the background of every crisis. Push too hard, and the cost spreads far beyond the battlefield. That threat has value precisely because it is so extreme, which is exactly why using it carelessly would be a mistake. That is the first signal in this story. Iran's new supreme leader appears to understand that some weapons are strongest when they remain partly unused. If you close the strait completely, you get one giant shock. You create panic fast. But you also unite almost everyone against you at once. You turn fear into consensus. You give your enemies a cleaner argument. You make it easier for rivals, neighbors, and even hesitant powers to line up and say, this has gone too far. A selective strike sends a different message. It says, I can create danger without triggering total collapse. I can touch the system without smashing the system. I can raise the price of pressure while keeping the next move uncertain. And uncertainty is power. Think about how shipping actually works. You do not need to sink every vessel to create damage. You only need to destroy the feeling of safety. One attack can raise insurance costs. 2 attacks can change routes. A few more can slow movement, delay cargo, and force governments to spend more on escorts and protection. Markets react to risk long before they react to complete shutdown. Fear moves faster than blockades. That means striking selected tankers may achieve something important for Tehran. It may raise economic pressure on its rivals while avoiding the political explosion that would come from sealing the whole strait. In simple terms, it is the difference between a warning shot and a declaration that there is no way back. And that brings us to the man at the center of the title. A new supreme leader does not inherit only power. He inherits doubt. Even inside his own system, people watch closely. They want to know if he is decisive. They want to know if he can survive pressure. They want to know if he understands timing. Abroad, intelligence agencies, markets, diplomats, and militaries are trying to read the same signals. So his first moves in a crisis are not random reactions. They are tests. They are messages. They are also performances, but not in the television sense, in the strategic sense. If he had closed Hormuz immediately, many people would have called it strong. But strength and control are not the same thing. A dramatic act can prove anger. It does not always prove discipline. And discipline is exactly what a new leader may want to display first. By striking tankers instead of shutting the passage entirely, he may be saying something very specific. I am willing to escalate, but I will choose the scale. I can hurt you, but I will decide the size of the wound. I am not frozen, I'm not weak, but I am not going to spend my biggest card in the first round either. That last part matters. In a long confrontation, the biggest mistake weaker states make is using their most powerful leverage too early. Once you play the most extreme option, the ladder gets shorter. Fewer steps remain. Flexibility disappears. The conflict becomes harder to manage. The other side stops asking what you might do and starts preparing for the worst version of you. That can be dangerous for any country. It can be especially dangerous for one facing a stronger military coalition. So what if restraint here is not hesitation? What if restraint is the strategy? That possibility makes this story much more serious than many headlines suggest, because a patient opponent is often harder to handle than a reckless one. A reckless opponent makes it easy for the world to react. A patient opponent creates gray zones. He keeps the pressure high enough to hurt, but low enough to complicate a united response. He forces others to keep recalculating. He turns every limited move into a question. Is this the ceiling or just the beginning? Is this warning, negotiation, testing, or setup? That is exactly why selected tanker strikes can be so powerful as a signal. They create fear, but also ambiguity. They tell every government in the region that the shipping lanes are vulnerable. They tell energy markets that calm cannot be assumed. And they tell Washington that Iran still has more options in reserve. Notice what this does to the Gulf states as well. If you are a Gulf monarchy hosting American military cooperation or depending on regional stability for trade and investment, selective attacks put you in a deeply uncomfortable position. A full closure of Hormuz would be a global emergency. Everyone would see it. Everyone would react. But limited strikes create a more personal kind of pressure. Your ships, your ports, your insurance costs, your investors, your image of stability. Suddenly, the cost of the crisis is not abstract. It is sitting in your own waters, on your own balance sheet, inside your own risk calculations. That means Tehran may not only be talking to Washington, it may also be talking to the Gulf. The message could be, if you help pressure us, your own sense of normal business will disappear first. Now pause here, because this is where the analysis gets deeper. If Iran truly wanted to maximize short-term chaos, there were louder ways to do it. But loud is not always smart. The smarter move may be one that changes how everyone around you behaves. Shipping companies become cautious. Regional governments become nervous. Importers start thinking about supply risk. Diplomats start taking calls they were ignoring. And all of that can happen without Tehran crossing the line that would make even reluctant powers support overwhelming retaliation. In other words, selective violence can be a form of negotiation. Not polite negotiation, not public negotiation, but negotiation all the same. It raises the price of continuing pressure. It tells the other side, if this goes on, the costs will spread. Yet because the strait remains open, it also leaves space for de-escalation. That is not an accident. That is design. If you are finding this breakdown useful, pause for a second and save the video now, because the next time a headline looks small, you will know how to spot the strategy hiding inside it. And if this kind of analysis helps you think more clearly, hit subscribe and send this to a friend who loves geopolitics but hates lazy talking points. Now let's look at another layer people often miss. Closing Hormuz does not only hurt Iran's enemies, it can hurt countries Iran needs. That includes major Asian buyers and partners whose economies depend on energy flows through the Gulf. This is where the new leader's calculation may be even colder than it first appears. A full shutdown would not just punish Washington or its regional partners. It would also risk angering the very powers Tehran wants to keep close. This matters because modern conflict is not only about missiles and ships. It is also about economic lifelines, diplomatic cover, sanctions pressure, and access to markets. A state under heavy pressure cannot think only in battlefield terms. He has to think about who still buys its oil, who still trades with it, who still gives it room to breathe. If you damage those relationships in one emotional move, you may win 1 week of headlines and lose much more after that. So when Iran avoids a total closure, it may be telling outside powers something important too. I know where the red lines really are. I know how to hurt my enemies without burning my own support system. I know how to show force without becoming impossible to defend. That is a very different image from the one many people in the West automatically imagine when they think about Tehran under pressure. The stereotype is simple: rage, slogans, overreaction, chaos. But the message behind a selective tanker strike is almost the opposite. It suggests control. It suggests calculation. It suggests someone trying to prove he can manage escalation, not just ignite it. And that may be the most unsettling part. Because if Iran's new supreme leader is trying to present himself as disciplined rather than impulsive, he is not only speaking to enemies, he is speaking to potential partners. He is saying, I am not a wild card. I am not a man who will destroy shared interests in a moment of pride. I can be trusted to use pressure carefully. That kind of image has value. It can strengthen diplomacy behind closed doors. It can reassure states that want stability more than drama. It can make outside powers think twice before assuming Iran can be cornered into one giant self-destructive mistake. And it can increase the credibility of every future threat, because a controlled actor is often believed more than an emotional one. There's also a psychological dimension here that should not be ignored. Silence can be part of power. A leader who says very little, then makes one sharp move, forces everyone else to do the talking. Experts debate his intentions. Markets react. Rivals guess. Allies wait. He becomes the subject of interpretation instead of the prisoner of his own rhetoric. That is a dangerous position to occupy, because it gives him room. If he is loud and theatrical, every speech becomes a trap. Every promise becomes a test. Every red line becomes something the other side can challenge. But if he stays mostly silent and lets action speak, he keeps more freedom. He can escalate a little, pause, shift, bargain, deny, threaten, or step back without looking as inconsistent. This may be exactly what we are seeing. A limited tanker strike says enough to shape behavior, but not enough to close every door. It is visible enough to move markets, but limited enough to preserve options. It is aggressive enough to project strength at home, but measured enough to avoid total isolation abroad. And that balance is hard to achieve. It requires understanding not just military capability, but political timing. It requires seeing the battlefield, the shipping lane, the oil market, the diplomatic channel, and the domestic audience as part of the same board. That is why this act matters so much. Not because it is the biggest move available, but because it may reveal the kind of mind now running the game. There is another reason this signal matters. It changes the way future moves should be interpreted. If the first major pattern is calibrated pressure rather than total rupture, then the next steps may follow that logic too. More limited disruptions, more targeted pain, more attempts to raise costs without triggering universal alignment against Iran. That does not mean the situation is safe. In some ways, it means the opposite. A long gray conflict can be more exhausting, more expensive, and more destabilizing than one giant explosive moment. Why? Because it stretches nerves. It keeps insurers nervous, traders cautious, governments divided, and militaries busy. It creates a climate where nobody feels secure enough to relax, but not threatened enough to resolve everything at once. It turns the crisis into a contest of endurance and calculation. And weaker states often prefer exactly that kind of contest. They know they may not dominate an open conventional war. So they look for ways to make superiority feel costly, slow, and politically frustrating. They do not always seek instant victory. Sometimes they seek durable leverage. That is why the tanker decision may be less about immediate military effect and more about strategic storytelling. A story told to Washington, to Gulf capitals, to Asian importers, to domestic elites, and to the wider world. The story says, Iran still has reach. Iran still has tools. Iran is under pressure, but not out of options. And under its new leader, it may be choosing patience over spectacle. Let me push that one step further. If patience is the signal, then the title of this video becomes even more revealing. What did the new supreme leader signal by striking tankers? Not Hormuz. He may have signaled that he understands the difference between hurting the system and breaking it. He may have signaled that he wants leverage, not martyrdom. He may have signaled that he is willing to escalate in slices rather than all at once. And he may have signaled that his idea of strength is not volume, but control. That is a serious message in the middle of a dangerous region. It also means outside observers should stop asking only whether Iran can close the strait. That question is too narrow. The more useful question is what level of disruption Tehran believes serves its interests best. Because sometimes the most powerful move is not the one that shocks the world in a single night. It is the one that changes behavior over weeks and months while keeping your opponents uncertain about where the ceiling really is. If that shift in perspective is clicking for you, here's my second request. Drop a comment with the one word that best describes this strategy. And if you want more videos that go beyond the obvious, subscribe now and share this with someone who still thinks geopolitics is only about the loudest explosion. Now let's talk about what this could mean next. If this reading is right, then the most likely pattern is not immediate maximum escalation. It is controlled pressure with room for bargaining. That could mean more threats around shipping, more selective actions, more signaling through proxies, or more carefully timed steps that remind everyone the risk has not gone away. Each act would serve the same purpose: increase the cost of pressure without forcing a final showdown before Tehran is ready. That is a very different scenario from the simple movie version people like to imagine. In the movie version, one dramatic event changes everything. In real strategy, powerful actors often prefer ambiguity. They use a series of moves, each one sharp enough to matter, but not so extreme that they lose control of the board. And that is what makes this moment so important to understand. Because if the world misreads selective restraint as weakness, it may respond badly. It may keep increasing pressure while assuming Tehran has blinked. But if restraint is actually chosen leverage, then pushing harder may invite more calibrated pain, not surrender. At the same time, Iran also has to manage risk. A strategy of limited disruption can work only if it stays limited enough to avoid creating a united global front. The line is thin. One strike can warn. Repeated strikes can alarm. A campaign that begins with precision can slide into something much wider if miscalculation takes over. So none of this means the situation is stable. It means the danger may come through managed escalation that suddenly stops being manageable. That is often how serious crises grow, not from one side wanting total war from the start, but from both sides trying to control the temperature and discovering too late that the thermostat is broken. Which brings us back to leadership. The first weeks of a new leader often create the frame through which all later actions are judged. If he appears weak, challengers push. If he appears reckless, coalitions harden. But if he appears disciplined, unpredictable, and patient, the whole environment shifts. People stop looking for the final move and start studying the pattern. And right now, the pattern matters more than the blast itself. A tanker strike tells us something about capability, yes, but more importantly, it tells us something about intent, not full intent. No one outside the inner circle knows that. But enough intent to matter. Enough to suggest that the new supreme leader may see power not as one dramatic eruption, but as the art of applying measured pressure while protecting future options. That would fit a leader who is thinking about survival, legitimacy, deterrence, and negotiation all at once. It would also fit a leader who knows that history often punishes countries, not only for being weak, but for being unable to stop themselves once the crisis begins. So maybe the most revealing fact here is not that tankers were struck. Maybe it is that the strait stayed open. That open water is not proof of peace. It is proof of calculation. It suggests someone made a conscious decision to wound the system instead of detonating it. Someone decided that partial fear was more useful than full panic. Someone decided that keeping the world nervous was better than making the whole world unite. And if that is true, then the West may be facing a more complicated opponent than many expected. Not an opponent with unlimited power. Not an opponent without vulnerabilities. But an opponent that may be trying to turn discipline itself into a weapon. That should get attention, because disciplined pressure can outlast outrage. It can survive headlines. It can keep markets on edge. It can strain alliances. It can force stronger powers to spend more, explain more, and protect more. It can create the feeling that even when one side dominates militarily, the other side still controls the rhythm of risk. And in a region built on shipping lanes, oil flows, alliances, and perception, controlling the rhythm of risk can be a form of power all by itself. So when you look at this title again, do not hear it as a narrow question about one incident. Hear it as a question about doctrine, about mindset, about the kind of leadership that chooses pressure over spectacle, ambiguity over finality, and leverage over emotional release. Because that may be what the tanker strike was really about. Not a random act, not just retaliation, not simply anger, an introduction, a warning. And maybe the clearest statement yet, that Iran's new supreme leader wants the world to see him as a man who will not waste his sharpest weapon just to prove he has one. That is why this story matters. The ships were the visible event. The restraint was the signal. And the signal may shape everything that comes next. So the next time you see a headline saying a few tankers were hit while Hormuz stayed open, do not dismiss it as a smaller crisis. Ask the harder question. What if the smaller move was chosen precisely because it was smarter? What if the absence of the biggest escalation is not comfort, but strategy? And what if the most important message in this whole moment is that the new leader is telling the world very quietly that he intends to play a long game? If you want more breakdowns that turn confusing headlines into clear signals, make sure you are subscribed, share this video with your smartest friend, and come back for the next one. Because the biggest shifts in geopolitics are often hidden inside the moves that look just small enough to ignore.